A common way of fastening materials together is with various kinds of threaded fasteners, bolts, screws, and so forth. And they come in all sizes. These are really multi-purpose, multi-benefit fasteners, so there are a number of uses besides just holding parts together. You can carry loads and transmit power, and you can also use threaded fasteners to adjust locations. A common place you see that is in motor mounts for moving a motor back and forth to tighten a belt, for example. And the advantages of fasteners are multiple. For one thing, you can join materials that are dissimilar. You could join a piece of plastic with a piece of steel using a threaded fastener. Obviously, you cannot do that with welding. The plastic will melt way before the metal will melt. And bolts and screws are removable. So you could use an adhesive to fasten plastic and steel together, but then that would be that. You wouldn't be able to get it apart easily. If you use a threaded fastener, no problem. You can put it together and take it apart multiple times. This is a big advantage for a lot of designs. And you don't need a great deal of skill or fancy tools to use these. Ordinary wrenches will work just fine, and pretty much anyone, most people, could install and remove threaded fasteners. So they're kind of nice all-purpose fasteners. I highly recommend to you this book called Machinery's Handbook. It's a really, really big book. Might not look like it here, but these pages are tissue thin. It's something like 2,000 pages, 1,500 pages, something like that. You can see the thumb tabs in here. It's divided into all kinds of sections, all of which have to do with machinery. So there are sections on bolts and screws, for example, and this is where you can look up thread sizes, tolerances on threads, how to tap a thread, what sizes the bolt head and nuts are. Anything you want to know about fasteners is in there, along with just a bazillion other topics related to mechanical drawing and design. Here are the ASME standards related to fasteners. And then let me just point out a couple of sources that I like. One, in Eugene, Oregon, there's a fastener store called Eugene Fastener, where they have a diverse array of fasteners and people on the sales staff who know about fasteners. So if you run into a challenging problem, you can go there and ask them questions. And then manufacturers' websites all have details about size and shape. Some are better than others. The company Fastenal has been in business for a while, and they have a pretty good website, but there are many others. You can go to the ThomasNet, that's all one word, the ThomasNet website, which is like an online yellow pages of manufacturers, and just look up threaded fasteners. Well, on we go. So let's look at types of bolts and screws. And here we're thinking about vocabulary. Now, according to technical sources, and including Machinery's Handbook, a bolt is something that you fasten with a nut. This might be a little different than what we're used to thinking about, but if it's a bolt, that means there's a nut of some kind. Sometimes you'll see in Machinery's Handbook and in the hardware bin that because a bolt doesn't need threads to go into a threaded hole, it just needs enough threads to catch a nut, you sometimes see a length of bolt where they didn't bother to thread it because you don't need it. It's just the tail end of the bolt that might be threaded. And you can look in Machinery's Handbook for details about that. They will give you a picture like this one, and then this tells you what part is unthreaded and what part is threaded, and you can look that up in the adjoining table if you need it. So bolt, fastened with a nut. A screw is not fastened with a nut. A screw fits into a threaded hole, and then to tighten it you have to put a wrench or a screwdriver or something on the head. That's how you tighten it. And I've given you the descriptions out of Machinery's Handbook, and they take these descriptions from ASME. So here is Machinery's Handbook saying a screw is something that goes into a threaded hole, and you tighten it by turning the head of the fastener. So just to summarize, bolt, fastened with a nut. Screw, fastened by turning the head of the screw. And then a stud is a thing that's threaded on both ends. So you can put one end into a threaded hole, another end with a nut, or both ends with a nut, or whatever you need. That's a stud. Oh, and you can weld them on too. So bolt, screw, stud. Machinery's Handbook refers to these things, these heavy screws, as cap screws. Now, I know that if you go out into the shop out there in the world and you say, oh no, somebody calls something a bolt, and you say, oh no, that's not a bolt, that's a cap screw, they're going to look at you funny. So we'll just keep this between ourselves. You have the knowledge, you know what they are really called, but out there in the world, if somebody calls it a bolt and it's really a screw, or they call it a screw and it's really a bolt, that'll be fine. Now a machine screw is it's a screw, so it threads into a threaded hole, and it's small. It's small and it has a flat end. Oftentimes you see these Philister heads or round heads. There are various kinds of heads, but small, flat end. And then a set screw is quite small. It's got a hardened point, and its purpose is to keep something from moving. For example, you know how we've looked at putting sheaves onto a shaft for a gear, for a V-belt drive, or we put a gear onto a shaft. And in several of the things we've looked at, we've seen holes for set screws. Well, that is to keep the gear from bouncing off the shaft, or if there's a key, to keep the key from vibrating out of the keyway. So that's a set screw. Then there are kinds of screws where they will make their own threads. And there are two main families of these self-tapping screws. One of them is a thread cutting screw. And you can see, looking at the end of the screw here, or up here on the left, there's kind of a valley cut into it. That's one way you can recognize it. These things cut the material as you drive them in, and therefore, because they're cutting material, they produce chips, and the chips will come out through that valley thing. You cannot reuse these over and over again, but there you go. A thread forming screw does not produce chips. It actually squeezes the material. It forms the material by pressing against it as you drive the screw in. So that means a couple of things. One, it holds well. It resists loosening. And two, believe it or not, you can reuse these multiple times. Last two slides are about bolt heads and screw heads. There is a diverse variety of bolt head types and screw head types. With bolts, one kind you are probably familiar with is a hex head, so called because the head is six-sided. It's a hexagon. There are others that are square. There are carriage bolts. There are round heads, but it's common to see a hex head bolt. and then a hex nut that goes with it. In screws, there are many screw head types. You'll notice that some of them will sit flush inside the material. For example, these countersunk heads, these flat heads, we call them, those will sit flush with the material. Others might sit up above the material, so that here's a philoster head. Notice the difference between the philoster head and the round head, for example. I think I don't have an oval head, but an oval head is similar to a round head. It's just slightly different shape. Oh yeah, and here's a truss head. It's like a round head, but slightly flatter. Here's a pan head. And then, in all these screw heads, you have different ways of using a tool to assemble them. So a socket head has a hexagonal hole that you put an Allen wrench into, or it might have one of these star-shaped holes. There are slotted heads that you put a screwdriver blade into, and Phillips heads, you know what those look like. They have kind of a star-shaped hole. You can find these types of heads in both cap screws, and bolts. Now, I don't know about you. I find this whole quantity of fastener heads fascinating. I love to go into catalogs and just look around and see what are the choices. And then I kind of like to go into a place like Eugene Fastener and ask them about these choices. So here they are. Again, I recommend Machinery's Handbook, manufacturers' websites, and a supplier like Eugene Fastener.